I'm Ron Edwards with ChineseEconomicHistory.com, and we're here at the World Economic History Congress being held in Kyoto, Japan. And today we're quite honored and pleased to have Professor Bin Wong interviewed as a part of our series of Chinese economic historians. Professor Bin Wong has a PhD from Harvard, and he is currently the Distinguished Professor of History at UCLA and Director of UCLA's Asia Institute. His interest is mainly Chinese economic and social history, and he's had a wide variety of contributions in the field, and is quite an eminent Chinese economic historian as well. We first like to start off with a couple questions of interest to our target audience, and that is, first of all, the typical view of economists of long-run economic performance of the world and countries in general is that output per capita and population are roughly constant or slightly grow. And sometimes this is called a Malthusian trap, it's referred to. And then at some point they make a jump to economic growth, and this is kind of usually based on Western Europeans' experience. So I'd like to begin by asking you, do you believe that China's economic development path is the same as the West's?
Well, thank you, Ron. I think those are important questions. For me, in fact, there are two questions at stake. And what do we know about historically the experience of economic growth, especially types of growth before the Industrial Revolution, the late 18th century, and the particular cluster of changes that create the conditions for modern economic growth as most economists think about growth. That's one set of questions. And then the second set of questions is whether or not Europe's actual historical experience conforms with the expectation that they left behind a kind of Malthusian situation in order to embark upon growth. And I say the two are separate because, in fact, what economists who do economic history of Europe have been arguing for quite a while now is that indeed Europe, in fact, developed the 19th century changes they developed precisely because they were not caught in the Malthusian trap, in particular that the English had a higher standard of living, they had the capital, they had the scientific traditions and the technological curiosities to develop the kinds of tools necessary for an industrial revolution. So in that sense, the English experience itself and what we think about Western Europe more generally doesn't quite fit the stylized picture that sometimes comes across for economists about, or in fact, it informs a lot of ways economists think about other parts of the world. Now, on the question of, having said that, I would also say then separately that, in fact, Europe's experience both has elements of principles that are economic principles that, in fact, I think one sees in many places, namely the use of capital and labor is affected by the relative prices of these, that it matters that you have some kind of institutions that efficiently allocate your resources as well as your products and your services. And so a number of the basic principles that we associate with an efficient set of economic practices and the capacities to generate growth at some basic level are going to be similar in most societies. Having said that, I think the actual practices, historical institutional practices that develop in different parts of the world tend to vary. Within that framework then, I would say that China's actual economic history bears certain similarities to Europe's, but it certainly bears many differences from Europe that, in my opinion, as an economic historian, have long-term consequences. So that I think that understanding so-called modern economic growth, even in China today, understanding the period since the 1980s, requires not merely understanding a set of principles that are general in economics, but requires understanding how they're being applied in a very specific set of circumstances, namely in China, and that set of circumstances is informed by the experiences, economic and political experiences that this country has had over the previous several centuries.
This country being China?
China, correct.
Okay, very good.
And just if I may underline a point.
Please.
So the point is not that China is unique because its economic possibilities are historically embedded in a set of experiences, both positive and negative. I think that's, as an economic historian, that's an orientation and approach that I would apply to any world region, to Europe as much as to China. And that what I think we do as economic historians is we try to understand how basic economic principles end up being affirmed or violated in these different circumstances. And I don't think that there's any presumption, and certainly in my part empirically, that they're more often affirmed or denied in one place rather than another. I think that's an empirical question. So that the default assumption that because Europe developed industrial revolution before any other part of the world, that this must mean that Europe was always ahead of the rest of the world, is a kind of easy assumption which doesn't particularly fit with the kind of fragmentary information we have about the earlier history of these places. And I'm saying that those earlier practices can affect the ways in which development took place subsequently.
I see. So I'll attempt to give a fair summary is that China experienced both similarities and differences from Europe.
Absolutely.
So it's not exactly the same, but we certainly find both differences and similarities. Okay, so next quick question for Chinese Economic History.com. We typically ask our interviewees, what is your view towards China's economic performance during the Song Dynasty?
Well, within China's economic history, the Song Dynasty has a great importance because it's typically viewed by a range of historians as the period when there's really the development of a private economy that is not under any sort of government control. And we see the expansion of markets, of commercial organizations, and this is sort of powered by increases in agricultural productivity, the introduction of and spread of paddy rice agriculture, improvements in certain kind of craft technologies. We see better kinds of boats for riverine transportation.
I'm sorry, at one point I just want to quickly interject that these things that you're describing about the Song Dynasty are unprecedented at that point in time in Chinese history?
Certainly yes. Okay. Everything from the changes in the degree to which a private market economy develops, we tend to think of this as a Song Dynasty phenomenon. The development of a long-distance trade, of merchant organizations and marketing networks, of wholesaling as well as retailing, of there being considerable development of a material culture in cities, certain cities at least, which can only be supported if you have a kind of active mercantile community. These are things we see in certain parts of Song Dynasty China. So in the same way that we see subsequently, several centuries later, a fluorescence of economic activity in the Italian Mediterranean, one could argue one sees some similar, some parallel, some different features to economic activity several centuries earlier in China. So the Song Dynasty then becomes a very important period for Chinese historians, and including economic historians, because it's seen as a period of great transformation. And for economic historians, clearly the important part is the sense that this was a growing economy marked by institutional innovations and developments that enhanced both production and trade. And then there were a series of questions that follow for economic historians about, with this kind of apparent lead over Europe in terms of the visibility and importance of a sophisticated commercial economy, why was this economy didn't go on subsequently to experience an industrial revolution? And that is a part of the historiography within Chinese history that then has also informed the way in which certain Western economic historians have looked at China as well.
Okay, thank you. One other footnote I'd like to add to that, Eric L. Jones has written a book, and others have also gone along this line to argue similar lines of argument for other periods, the Italian city-states that you mentioned, but also Tokugawa Japan, and perhaps the Netherlands. John Narvaez has made this argument for the Netherlands, that there are these periods where there's a commercial expansion and due to institutions and so on and so forth. So in some sense, it seems at least possible that England was not the first to experience some of these key institutional factors which supported, to a degree, commercial expansion and agricultural productivity.
Oh, certainly, I think
and
economic historians in general agree with that. There's the recently published Cambridge History of Capitalism, which was a 2-volume history of capitalism, edited by Larry Neal and Jeff Williamson. Volume 1 is really various episodes of what the editors consider capitalism that emerge in places as distant as ancient Greece and the Silk Road. Now, it's a very difficult subject to explain the operations of economies, vibrant commercial economies, in different times and places based on very fragmentary or at least different types of evidence than makes up the record on which we judge economic performance, certainly after World War II, and to some extent, at least in Western countries, going back to the second half of the 19th century in many cases. So this is the incommensurability of some of our sources tends to make difficult, meaningful comparisons of what we mean by both capitalism and, for that matter, economic development before the clear onset of per capita growth, which really only occurs, it seems to me, in a conclusive manner after large amounts of technology in the 19th century are being applied to large parts of the economy.
Yes, it's certainly difficult to measure these because there are no national income accounts for the Song dynasty or ancient Greece or anything like that.
Exactly.
So it all depends on, roughly speaking, the very little quantitative evidence that we have, but it seems to be more based on largely qualitative evidence, and has to be taken whole, and there's judgments involved in all that.
Yeah, and what I would stress then is that, at least as I would see the economics profession, certainly the new institutional economics has made a great point of stressing the degree to which the rules according to which economic activity are undertaken influence the efficiency with which both resources are allocated and products and services are produced. And I think on that broad basis, we can make some assessments. And I would say that one of the challenges that the institutional economics faces is actually developing real metrics for deciding when institutions work well and when they don't. We only do a good job when the cases are so radically different that we can say, well, this clearly isn't a very good set of institutions because there's all this corruption or there's all this, negative rent-seeking with clearly negative impacts. Certainly the extreme cases of success and failure are visible, but there are many cases, most cases lie in between. And in those instances, it seems to me, in my opinion, there's much room for improvement in actually developing clear metrics of how we know an institution is good and how we know it's bad.
Well, that's very interesting. I find myself in complete agreement, actually, that since we don't have good measures of objective quantitative evidence or clear qualitative evidence, that we should throw institutions into the mix and see how institutions, what we think institutions, what type of institutions might give rise to what incentives. But that's a difficult job, but I think the good fight, and I think I agree with that.
Yes.
So enough of our questions. What we'd like to do now is concentrate on your work and give you an opportunity to explain to economists some of your work. And I'd like to start with one of your most influential books, China Transformed, which began with, as a basis, European historical experience. And you took these basic ideas in the book and tried to relate them to how China performed. And could I ask you to please
So this is a book that was published in 1997 in both English and Chinese, and it's still in print and being for sale and being bought in both those countries, both English-speaking countries and in China. It's a book that starts from the premise that many of our ideas about modern societies, in particular the formation of national states and the development of capitalist economies, is really a set of generalizations built around the European experience. So this affects both the disciplines of economics and political science especially, but also for that matter sociology and certainly the practice of history. In the book, I try to suggest a range of ways in which, in fact, we can see both similarities and differences between China and Europe, which are of great consequence to explaining why it is Europe as a world region that develops a set of competitive war-making states, which is so basic to what become national states and their dynamics in Europe, and why China is able to create an empire. And over a 2 millennia period, it's not that there's continuous empire, but empire is rebuilt several times, and there becomes a sort of path-dependent direction to the use of ideas and institutions that fit the ruling of an agrarian empire. And those turn out to be very different and with very different consequences for both politics and economics. And in fact, following that book, I published in 2011 with Jean-Laurent Rosenthal a book entitled Before and Beyond Divergence, The Politics of Economic Change in China and Europe. And that book, in some sense, from my perspective, and I think Professor Rosenthal probably agrees with this, though we don't particularly discuss it explicitly, is, from my point of view, for me, it's an extension and elaboration and a precise effort to think about the kinds of institutions that did matter in China, why some of the reasons given for China failing to develop when Europe did, which are based on institutional differences, we can't see the significance of the institutional differences to actual economic practices in any persuasive manner. They're more or less assumptions or assertions that because Europe had certain types of institutions, be they social or political, these must have helped economic growth. And we furthermore find that cases where we think we can talk about, and argue certainly, that institutions may in fact be different in the two places, but that the institutions to some extent can be substitutes for each other. So that to say that Chinese institutions are different than European institutions is really a different proposition than saying they're worse. And I think, again, what the challenge is in terms of institutions is to have metrics of deciding how well institutions perform. And in the pre-industrial world, that's something of a challenge because we lack the quantitative metrics that we would like to have that allow one to think of the indicators with which economists necessarily and understandably are most familiar, and upon which we rely in order to reach judgments about certainly contemporary and even modern economies. That is, economies since World War II, and in cases where good data exists going back to the 19th century.
I see. As I understand, you've also embarked on a new project, Global Economic History of the Long 19th Century, and in which you try to relate this period of economic history to some current issues, including those of China, U.S., and the European Union. Please,
Well,
please.
so
let
I
us-
would, yeah, so the two are somewhat related, though. Let me say what each is about and why this would be a pitch for why history really does matter to understanding economics. Within the history profession, there's been a move in the last 20, 25 years to doing more global history. In part, this is a reaction to the fact that there's been globalization since the 1980s. We've been living in a period driven by the economics of the situation, wherein there are clearly far more connections, much more shared institutional frameworks among economies in the world, especially following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the reconstruction of Eastern Europe, much more along capitalist lines, and with the tremendous and remarkable set of changes that have taken place in China, and then since the 1980s, which has yielded the highest rates of sustained economic growth, unprecedented in world history, and especially for us on the demographic and spatial scale that occurred in China. And this has happened, and there are great debates within and without China over how to characterize these specifically, but it's quite clear that these developments have taken place. And I belong to that broad group of people who would argue that these changes are anchored in a set of possibilities created by being a unified country of a grand scale, and that set of circumstances is historically created, that the size of the People's Republic of China, which is in large measure, not exclusively, there are specific places this has changed, but it's the size of China in the 19th century. And we should remember that the map of Europe is redrawn all the way through the 19th century. For that matter, Germany isn't created until the last 3 decades of the 19th century, and only after bitter wars between who's going to lead a German confederation between the Prussians and the Austrians. And we can look at all the parts of Europe. The number of times the map of Europe was redrawn, first by Napoleon's conquest in the early 19th century, again by the emergence of Germany, and for that matter, the emergence of Italy as a unified state. And it was redrawn again after World War I. And indeed, it's been redrawn since, both by the collapse of certain kinds of countries, such as the former Yugoslavia, and most importantly, since the end of World War II, the emergence of the European Economic Community, based on coal and steel in the early 50s, an aspiration for economic integration, and politically motivated by the desire to keep Germans from rising into a position of industrial strength from which could be derived military power, to the first instance in which Europe is again aspiring, and these days under great uncertainty, to forming a political union that would make Europe almost as large as China, with perhaps 2/3 the population. So what I'm actually alluding to here is a kind of subject to which I've moved since completing, or I'm finishing a short book, a long chapter. It comes out in 2 forms as part of a world history project that both Harvard and C.H. Beck, a German publisher, are planning. And so hopefully within the next year there will be a Harvard World History in several volumes. The 19th century volume of the 4 chapters in this large book, the 180-page chapter on economic history will be one that I've authored. But from that then, as I say, I've been moving to, I just was mentioning the importance of the European Union as a phenomenon in the post-World War II world, or the culmination of changes since the end of the Second World War. And from a global economic history point of view, we now have a would-be polity in Europe that is approaching the size of China. And for the first time, really, since the Han and Roman empires, we have political formations at either end of Eurasia which are similar in size spatially and similar in populations. In fact, the Roman and Han empires, both at their height, had roughly 60 million people, which in global historical terms at that point in time were just remarkably large. Now, they were organized very differently, but politically, and their economies were bounded by the same limitations of a pre-industrial world and the kinds of technologies available at that point in time, but they were by no means the same kind of economies. Having said that, it's striking that the economic histories and general histories of of the Roman Empire and the Europe of which it was, in a sense, the emblematic polity in that period, and the Chinese Empire, their histories for the next several thousand years are quite different. The next 2,000 years, China recurs in the construction of empire, and today we have in China a polity that is roughly the size of China at its greatest extent, built in the 18th and early 19th centuries. And in Europe, after the fall of the Roman Empire, we have various degrees of fragmentation that in some sense persist until the formation of the European Union. Now, I'm not suggesting that anyone looks at a map. The European Union is not literally physically the same territory as the Roman Empire, but it is the successor in the sense that it's a polity of a size in this part of the world, which is finally something on the scale of a China again. So one of the things I'm really interested in is trying to understand how are polities organized when they're large. It seems to me that in terms of in the world today, we have the United States, the EU, and China as three very large polities, each of which has a very important economy. Arguably, those are taking the EU's economy as a whole, along with the United States economy and China's economy. These are clearly the three most important economies in the world. And they have different histories institutionally that affect their economic options and possibilities today as well. And those are, in some sense, politically informed or defined. And in the spirit of this book I did with Jean-Laurent Rosenthal in 2011 called Before and Beyond Divergence, which is about the politics of economic change, I'm interested in following up a related set of questions today and in the future, but one wherein I hope to be able to gather different working groups of academics and possibly some policy type people to look at how certain types of issues are addressed in each of these three places, and economic issues, and how these are influenced by the institutional structures politically and economically that are dominant in these three world regions. And what I hope that will help show is what are the kind of principles that are common and that we can think of as general principles, and how are the way principles get translated into practice in very distinct ways because of the institutions that exist in these places. And to what extent can we imagine sort of the circulation or the movement of best practice amongst these places. What I'm reacting to in part, and I've been doing this since roughly the mid-90s in different kinds of meetings in Europe and in Asia, I'm reacting to, and I think this is a particularly American kind of assumption, we have no problem as American social scientists in assuming that we have a set of best practices that should move and become adopted elsewhere. So in the study of China, for instance, we have no problem imagining that however we organize anything in terms of our firm structure, our corporate structures, or for that matter, our political institutions, that these are best practices that should just translate to somewhere else. If, however, we turn around and say, well, let's look at performance, and let's look and try to understand, for instance, why the Chinese have been particularly successful at various kinds of activities. Or in another sense, when we complain about how the Chinese don't do things according to what we think are international norms, and we predict dire consequences, and those dire consequences never take place or have not to date. So for instance, economists have criticized state-owned enterprises for the last 30 years, have criticized the fragility of the banking system and the interference of political criteria with the manner in which it operates, and have long argued that without immediate and effective reforms, that the banking system would collapse. It still hasn't collapsed. Now, it may one day collapse, but it's a little anxiety-provoking to think that a proposition made over a 30-year period, when finally proven true at a particular point in time, demonstrates the truth value of that proposition for the previous 30 years in which it didn't hold. So I'm a little concerned about how we understand when institutions work, when they don't, and to accept the possibilities that different institutions work well in different contexts, and that in thinking about how institutional improvements are made, that we only think that the direction of improvement is from the West or the US, this is a particular American concern, I think, moves to China. If you ever say, therefore, well, if we look at responses to the financial crisis in 2008, isn't it interesting how the Chinese were able, the central government and the provincial governments, we're able to get people together and decide at a provincial level how much stimulus would come from a given province, how much from the center, in what areas the fiscal stimulus would be applied, whether it be in housing, different types of technology building, different types of infrastructure, different decisions were taken in different provinces. This was done very quickly. Now, we know these weren't perfect fixes. There are all kinds of problems with many of the policies implemented. But if you compare it to the institutionalized gridlock that exists in the American system, wherein nothing at the state and federal levels can be coordinated because of the separation institutionally, legally, of the powers and responsibilities each has, and most states in the United States have balanced budget provisions that prevent the notions of deficit spending at a time of weak private demand. And if we think even more visibly of the problems we all are acutely familiar with, not merely from the 2008 crisis, but to the current day, of the absence of an effective monetary set of central bank policies in the EU, and the difficulties this makes for problems today structurally, but in the context, say, of how they responded to the 2008 financial crisis, the limitations imposed by that political system. So if one says, gee, should we look at what the Chinese did and ask, is there anything in these, the way they solve things that should be a model for movement in the other direction, you get immediate criticism of, well, of course, none of this is possible in our system because they can do things we can't do. That's absurd to even suggest. And I say in response, then why are we so confident that the symmetric expectation, namely that whatever we do can be easily moved to the Chinese system, is valid in such a black and white manner? And it seems to me that we're now at a point in world history, in terms of how economies work, how polities are constructed, that we can actually ask more concrete questions about policies. How are policies decided about issues of water supply, about issues of pollution, about issues of any number of fiscal issues, are all subjects that matter tremendously to both politics and economics, and are conceived and addressed in different ways in different parts of the world. And I think we're at a point in time where I hope we can have a more systematic set of research projects that take this as a challenge for understanding the global possibilities in the future, which I'm arguing as an historian and as an economic historian are very much shaped by past experiences.
Well, it sounds like a very ambitious project, one which I look forward to reading about, finding about.
That will be a project hopefully involving many collaborators in both Europe, China, and the United States.
U.S. But that's quite ambitious to talk about how different organizations inform political policy decisions and economic performance in different institutional and environmental conditions. That's very interesting to think about, and I look forward to reading about this. So I think we've taken enough of your time today. I know you have a plenary session, and we'd like to thank again Professor Ben Wong for his time today, and wish you the best, and hope you enjoy the rest of the
Thank you, Ron.
The conference here.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.
All right.
Thank you. Of principles that are economic principles that, in fact, I think one sees in many places, namely the use of capital and labor is affected by the relative prices of these, that it matters that you have some kind of institutions that efficiently allocate your resources as well as your products and your services. And so a number of the basic principles that we associate with an efficient set of economic practices and the capacities to generate growth at some basic level are going to be similar in most societies. Having said that, I think the actual practices, historical institutional practices that develop in different parts of the world tend to vary. Within that framework, then, I would say that China's actual economic history bears certain similarities to Europe's, but it certainly bears many differences from Europe that, in my opinion, as an economic historian, have long-term consequences. So that I think it's that understanding so-called modern economic growth, even in China today, that's one set of questions. And then the second set of questions is whether or not Europe's actual historical experience conforms with the expectation that they left behind a kind of Malthusian situation in order to embark upon growth. And I say the two are separate because, in fact, what economists who do economic history of Europe have been arguing for quite a while now is that indeed Europe, in fact, developed the 19th century changes they developed precisely because they were not caught in a Malthusian trap, in particular that the British, the English, had a higher standard of living, they had the capital, they had the scientific traditions and the technological curiosities to develop the kinds of tools necessary for an industrial revolution. So in that sense, the English experience itself and what we think about Western Europe more generally doesn't quite fit the stylized picture that sometimes comes across for economists about, or in fact, it informs a lot of ways economists think about other parts of the world. Now, on the question of having said that, I would also say then separately that, in fact, Europe's experience both has elements, understanding the period since the 1980s requires not merely understanding a set of principles that are general in economics, but requires understanding how they're being applied in a very specific set of circumstances, namely in China, and that set of circumstances is informed by the experiences, economic and political experiences that this country has had over the previous several centuries.
This country being China?
China, correct.
Okay, very good.
And just if I may underline a point.
Please.
So the point is not that China is unique because its economic possibilities are historically embedded in a set of experiences, both positive and negative. I think that's, as an economic historian, that's an orientation and approach that I would apply to any world region, to Europe as much as to China. And that what I think we do as economic historians is we try to understand how basic economic principles end up being affirmed or violated in these different circumstances. And I don't think that there's any presumption, and certainly in my part empirically, that they're more often affirmed or denied in one place rather than another. I think that's an empirical question. So that the default assumption that because Europe
Hello, I'm Ron Edwards with ChineseEconomicHistory.com, and we're here at the World Economic History Congress being held in Kyoto, Japan. And today we're quite honored and pleased to have Professor Bin Wong interviewed as a part of our series of Chinese economic historians. Professor Bin Wong has a PhD from Harvard, and he is currently the Distinguished Professor of History at UCLA and Director of UCLA's Asia Institute. His interest is mainly Chinese economic and social history, and he's had a wide variety of contributions in the field, and is quite an eminent Chinese economic historian as well. We first like to start off with a couple questions of interest to our target audience, and that is, first of all, the typical view of economists of long-run economic performance of the world and countries in general is that output per capita and population are roughly constant or slightly grow. And sometimes this is called a Malthusian trap, and it's referred to. And then at some point, they make a jump to economic growth, and this is kind of usually based on Western Europeans' experience. So I'd like to begin by asking you, do you believe that China's economic development path is the same as the West's?
Well, thank you, Ron. I think those are important questions. For me, in fact, there are two questions at stake. And what do we know about historically the experience of economic growth, especially types of growth before the Industrial Revolution, the late 18th century, and the particular cluster of changes that create the conditions for modern economic growth as most economists think about growth.